Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In the middle of this long green season, ordinary time after Pentecost, we thought it'd be fun to do something a little different. And Transfiguration gives us that opportunity to do white. This morning at 8, Ann said this wasn't white, but this was. Do white, which is what we do for special days in terms of liturgical colors. And also because I think there's something about Transfiguration. Well, first of all, it's a favorite story of mine, but it's also got something, I think, to say to all of us in transition, whether as individuals, which of course is all of us, or as a congregation, which by definition is all of us congregated in this place. We start out recognizing, that both of these are mountaintop stories. Moses coming down from the mountain, he's been up on the mountain of Sinai, literally receiving the Word of God, talking to God, and as is often the case with people who have had mountaintop or peak experiences, he glowed. I don't mean he glowed like a candle flame or a light bulb, but there's a radiance to people who have been opened up and touched, who have had that kind of experience that recalibrates their view of the world, their worldview, if you want to use the technical term, that exposes them and us to things that we hadn't seen before, or ways of seeing that we hadn't experienced before, to possibilities, connections, relationships. Mountains are unique in that they are, of course, above everything, so you get a different perspective. And when you've had that kind of an experience, whether it's literally on a mountaintop or through an event, a spiritual transformation, a spiritual enkindling. I've seen people come out of Curcio with that glow. I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's toes here. I don't mean that stupid Jesus grin. I mean a glow. People who are on fire and incandescent with the presence of the Spirit. Moses is clearly like that, and what happens is it terrifies the rest of the people. They say, Moses, you got to cover that. You can't just let that out like that. You'll scare all the children. Or somebody, I'm not sure. Usually whenever we say you're going to scare all the children or scare the people, it means I'm terrified and I wish you'd stop. But they asked Moses to cover his face, and so we get this business that Moses uncovers to go into the temple, or the tent rather, of meeting and talk to God, and then he comes back out and covers himself up. I don't want to talk about covering up, but I don't think it's a good idea. Instead, though, we've got this mountaintop experience that changes Moses, that in the course of that is institutionalized in the law, in the Torah. Classically, the Ten Commandments, one imagines Moses coming down the mountain with those over his shoulders, but that, of course, is taken as the summary of the fullness of Torah, all 637 laws and instructions and guidances and so on and so forth. And that people was changed forever. When Jesus had had enough of trotting around the Galilee area, he took with him Peter and James and John. The key three, not by accident the same three who will go with him to the mountain at Golgotha. Not quite as big a mountain, not Golgotha. Come on, brain. Gethsemane in the garden. This time, though, they don't fall asleep. They stay awake. And we hear from Peter in the letter from Peter, but also from Luke narrating it, what happened. They're up there praying, and Jesus prays in such a way that everything opens up just like Moses on top of the mountain, and he is transfigured. He is literally changed in his appearance, and he becomes radiant. It's clear that this is a powerful spiritual experience. And then suddenly they see him talking with two figures. Luke tells us that it's Moses and Elijah, the two most significant figures in the Old Testament, or at least two of the most significant figures in the Old Testament, talking with Jesus, apparently just about as casually as could be, about what he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. We're reminded of that in the queuing up line of this reading, about 8 days after he had predicted his betrayal, crucifixion, and resurrection. This event takes place. And he's talking with Moses and Elijah. Luke knows it's Moses and Elijah. I don't know how Luke knew, because Moses or Elijah don't have Facebook pages. Well, they probably do now, but they didn't then. But somehow the quality of that moment made it clear that that's who this was. And they were talking about this thing that Jesus was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. And right then, Peter, this is another reason I love this story, because I love Peter. Peter is the first biblical instance of adult ADHD. It comes into Peter's mind and it is out Peter's mouth. Lord, it's good we're here. Let us build 3 booths, 3 tabernacles, 3 little altars, 3 commemorative stands. 1 for you, 1 for Moses, and 1 for Elijah. And then the key thing comes along in this reading that I think relates to all of us who have had pinnacle or peak or mountaintop or whatever experiences, whether on a mountaintop or on the water or in a classroom or wherever else, maybe even in church. And before Peter can go any further, it's interesting, Luke tells us he didn't know what he was saying. It's the in the mind out the mouth business, and a cloud comes. This is not just a cloud like we got outside today. This is a local high-energy fog. This is a divine presence cloud. This is the Shekinah in Hebrew, the presence, the glory of the Lord. The same thing that will shine on the shepherds outside of Bethlehem. This cloud comes and overtakes them, overwhelms them, encompasses them, and they are rightly terrified. So much for Peter's discourse on why we should build booths. Now, before we keep going, let me say that what Peter is really proposing is let's freeze this moment in time. Let's take this Polaroid picture so that, as Jimmy Buffett says, taking Polaroid pictures that are never in focus just to look at when we finally slow down, to remember what it was like that day on the mountain, misses the point, because when you have a mountaintop experience, you don't go on forward the same way you were when you started. You go on changed. You go on differently. And so you don't need to hold the thing in commemoration as some sort of sacred little thing that we take down once a year on the anniversary of the day. Our very beings are changed. Our very beings as individuals, our very beings as a congregation. The cloud encompasses them, and they're terrified, recognizing what that cloud is. And out of the cloud comes a voice. The same voice that Jesus and others, depending on which version of the gospel you use, heard when Jesus came up out of the waters of baptism. The same words that are used in Psalm 2, which is where that comes from, which is an enthronement psalm for the enthronement of the king, in which process the king is adopted as God's son. This is my son, the beloved. And then even Peter gets it both ways. In some cases, Peter's, it's the beloved. That is at 8 o'clock.
Chosen.
My chosen, the beloved. But one says, listen to him. One says, follow. The voice from the cloud says, forget about your commemorative plans. Live differently. Because what he's going to lead us to is, of course, Jerusalem. Which is a much greater achievement. It's like that line from Ephesians a couple of weeks ago that I love in the college. More than we can ask or imagine. But in order for us to receive that more than we can ask or imagine, to be transformed, we have to let go of what we were before. Not completely. We don't stop being who we were, but we are who we were plus that much more. Transfiguration reminds us that what we are to do is to open ourselves to the experience of the divine in our lives, in mountaintops or in church or in wherever we encounter it, however we encounter it, but then not try to freeze it, not try to put what a friend of mine calls God in a box, but rather incorporate it into our lives, into our being, so that we as individuals and as a community go forward change. Transfiguration is about wonderful, wonderful things that we do not allow to freeze in time and define us at that moment, but continue to incorporate, continue to live out. There's a reason that Luke closes his story of the Transfiguration by saying that they didn't tell anybody. Because nobody would understand until after the resurrection. There's some scholarly debate about whether the Transfiguration is a post-resurrection appearance that gets inserted earlier in the storyline, or whether it really happened. I honestly don't care one way or the other, but it tells us who it is that Jesus is. Jesus is revealed to be talking to Moses, Elijah, addressed from the cloud, encompassed by the cloud, changed, and by his changing, Peter, James, and John, and we are changed. Changed for the better, changed to open ourselves to that radiance that pervades all of us, if only we let it, changed and allowed to go forward as more and better and greater than we could have asked or imagined beforehand. As we go through the process of transition, I pray that we remember this story, that we keep the possibility of God's presence in us, lighting us up, changing our lives, changing who we become, so that we can go from glory to glory to glory, and not stop at the first thing that looks really good and think we're done. We're never done. It's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing project. It's ongoing work. It's an ongoing joy. And I pray that we have the grace, the equanimity, the courage, and did I mention the grace to do it, both as individuals and as a community. Amen.